The moment Henrietta Garrison stepped off that westbound train, every man on the platform of Caldwell, Kansas turned to look at her. Every man except one. It was the summer of 1879, and the Santa Fe line had delivered her from the suffocating drawing rooms of Cincinnati into a world that smelled of sun-baked earth, horse sweat, and something wilder than anything she had ever breathed before. The depot at Caldwell was a rough-hewn thing, not much more than a long plank building with a covered platform, its boards warping in the heat. Beyond it, the town stretched in a loose, confident sprawl of saloons and dry goods stores, and a livery stable that announced itself loudly through smell before sight. The cattle trail was nearby. She could hear it in the distant lowing that rolled across the prairie like slow thunder. She carried a single trunk and a small leather valise, and her dress, though practical dark blue wool that had seemed sensible in Ohio, but was already conspiring against her in the July heat, marked her immediately as someone who had not yet belonged to this place. Her hair was dark chestnut, pinned with more hope than skill after hours on the train, and she was 26 years old, which in Cincinnati had begun to feel like an embarrassment and in Kansas territory felt like absolutely nothing at all. The men on the platform stared, not maliciously, most of them simply with the frank, unguarded curiosity of men who lived in a place where unattached women arrived infrequently and were therefore treated like an unusual weather event. A pair of cowboys in trail-dusty boots craned their necks. A telegraph operator paused mid-stride and simply stopped, mouth slightly open. A man in a town suit looked up from his newspaper and did not look back down for a full 30 seconds. Even the station master, a heavy-set fellow with a gray mustache, watched her with an expression caught somewhere between official duty and personal wonder. She noticed all of this. She was a woman who had learned to notice such things because it was the only power she had reliably been given, the power of observation, of reading a room, of knowing before anyone said a word what the temperature of a situation truly was. And then she noticed the one man who was not looking. He was leaning against the far post of the depot platform, arms loosely crossed, one boot propped against the weathered wood behind him. He was looking out toward the open prairie, not performing disinterest, not deliberately making a show of not looking. He simply appeared to be genuinely engaged with something else entirely. The wide, flat horizon where the grassland met the sky in a line so clean it looked drawn with a ruler. He was tall, lean in the way that comes from actual work rather than fashionable restraint, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead under a well-worn hat. He wore canvas trousers and a shirt that had been washed enough times to soften to the color of winter sky. There was a rifle propped beside him, easy and familiar, the way a man might lean a walking stick. He was not staring. She noticed that before she noticed anything else about him. The station master finally broke free of his reverie and came forward to meet her, clipboard in hand, and she pulled her attention back to the business of her arrival. "Miss Garrison," he said, though it came out uncertain, as if he wasn't quite sure what he was looking at. "Mrs. Garrison," she said, and watched his expression recalibrate. She had made that correction so many times in the 2 years since Daniel Garrison had died of a fever outside Memphis that it no longer carried grief in it, just information. "Henrietta Garrison, I've come to take the schoolteacher position. I have correspondence from your town council." She produced the letter from her valise and presented it with the confidence of a woman who had spent several weeks convincing herself that moving to the Kansas frontier to teach school was not a desperate act but a courageous one. The station master, whose name was apparently Herschel Odom according to the peeling paint on his office door, read the letter with the concentrated effort of a man for whom reading was not automatic. Then he nodded, rolling his mustache slightly, and said, "Right, yes, the schoolhouse position. We've been expecting you, ma'am. Town council will want to meet with you tomorrow morning. Tonight the arrangement is for you to stay at the Caldwell house. That's the boarding house, not the hotel. The boarding house is respectable." He said the word respectable with the weight of a man who had to make that distinction regularly. "That sounds fine," Henrietta said. "I can have your trunk brought along. Is there a Mr. Garrison coming?" "No," she said simply. "There is not." Herschel Odom nodded and turned to wave at someone, and in doing so stepped aside enough that she had a clear view again of the lean man at the far post. He had finally shifted his gaze from the horizon, not toward her, but toward Herschel, as if the station master's wave had been directed at him. He uncrossed his arms and pushed off the post with unhurried ease. Up close, he was somewhat younger than she had first judged, perhaps 29 or 30, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor life into something more interesting than merely handsome. There were laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that she suspected had been earned honestly, and his jaw carried 2 days of dark stubble. His eyes, she noticed, were a quiet shade of gray-green like creek water in November. "Sullivan," Herschel said, "this is Mrs. Garrison, the new schoolteacher. She's staying at the Caldwell house. Could you bring her trunk along? Sheriff asked me to see she got settled before your business." The man named Sullivan looked at her then, and he looked at her the same way she had first seen him looking at the horizon, directly, without performance, without the gauging or the measuring that the other men had done. He simply looked at her as if she were a person who had arrived and to whom he was now being introduced. "Ma'am," he said, and lifted the brim of his hat slightly with 2 fingers. His voice was low and unhurried, a voice shaped by open spaces rather than parlors. "I'm happy to help." He did not smile with the eager, slightly flustered quality that some of the other men on the platform were now deploying in her direction. He simply meant what he said and said it, and then he moved to collect her trunk with practical efficiency. Henrietta watched him heft the trunk as if it weighed considerably less than it did, and she thought, with the quiet, precise part of her mind that had always been too honest to ignore, that this was a man she would like to know better. She pushed the thought aside immediately and followed Herschel Odom into the business of beginning her life in Caldwell, Kansas. The Caldwell House boarding house was run by a woman named Pearl Whitmore, who was somewhere between 50 and 60, had hair the color of steel wool, and possessed the commanding energy of a woman who had arrived in Kansas territory when it was truly wild, and had simply refused to be intimidated by any subsequent development. She fed Henrietta a plate of beans and cornbread within 10 minutes of her arrival, sat across from her at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and delivered a comprehensive introduction to Caldwell, Kansas in the manner of a woman who believed in getting the necessary business done immediately. The school was last year without a teacher because Mrs. Farnsworth went back east when her husband ran off, Pearl said without particular sentiment, as if this were merely a scheduling inconvenience. "The children have been running somewhat loose since then. Not bad children. Wild, though. You'll need a firm hand." "I have one," Henrietta said. Pearl looked at her appraisingly for a moment and then nodded, apparently satisfied. "How old are you?" 26. "You've been married." "I was. My husband died 2 years ago." Pearl nodded again, this time with a softness she permitted herself briefly. "Hard thing. Well, you're young enough and capable enough, and you don't seem to be made of paper, which is what I was worried about when they said they were bringing someone from Cincinnati. We've had teachers from back east before. Some of them don't last 6 weeks. I intend to last considerably longer than that," Henrietta said. Pearl almost smiled. "We'll see, now. Caldwell is a cattle town. You'll hear the drives, you'll smell them, and you'll become accustomed to both. The Kishom Trail runs close enough to matter. There are saloons. The cowboys who come through are mostly not trouble, but some are. Sheriff Beaumont keeps reasonable order. The town has been growing. There are families here now, proper families with children who need educating, and the town council takes the school seriously because it proves they're becoming civilized." She said the word civilized with a trace of dry amusement. "You'll meet them tomorrow." "Who is Tobias Sullivan?" Henrietta asked, and then felt faintly surprised at herself for asking. Pearl looked at her with the expression of a woman who never missed a thing. "What made you ask about him?" He helped carry my trunk from the depot. The station master called him by name. Ah, Pearl warmed her hands around her coffee cup. Tobias Sullivan. He's a good man. Came to Caldwell about 3 years back, came from Texas originally, though he doesn't talk about Texas much. He runs a small cattle operation out on the East Range, about 8 miles from town. Modest spread, maybe 200 head, nothing like the big operations, but it's his own and he works it honestly. He's not a trail cowboy, he's a rancher, which is a different thing, though some people don't distinguish. She paused. He does business in town regularly, sells beef locally, helps out when there's need of it. He's well regarded, quiet, not given to trouble. Is he married? Pearl's expression became something that was carefully neutral. No, he is not. Henrietta felt the warmth in her face and was grateful for the lamplight's inadequacy. I was simply asking because he was kind at the depot and I didn't know anyone in town. Of course, Pearl said, in the tone of a woman who believed absolutely none of that explanation but was prepared to allow it to stand. Henrietta slept that night in a narrow but clean bed in a room on the second floor, listening to the sounds of a frontier town settling itself into nighttime, the distant music from the saloons, the occasional horse on the street, the wind moving through the cottonwoods beyond the back fence. It was nothing like the sounds of Cincinnati. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she liked it. The town council the next morning consisted of 5 men who met her in the back room of Caldwell's general store, owned by a Mr. Ellery Potts, who also served on the council, and whose apron still bore evidence of his morning stocking work. The other members were the mayor, a banker named Drummond, a cattle buyer named Hayes, and Sheriff Beaumont, who appeared to be there primarily to assess whether she was likely to create any problems. They asked her questions about her qualifications, her experience. She had taught for 2 years in Cincinnati before Daniel's illness, and her intentions. She answered all of them with the direct competence she had spent the train ride rehearsing. And by the end of it, Mayor Ellison, who was a short man with the enthusiastic energy of someone who had bet heavily on Caldwell's future and needed to believe he was right, declared her position formally confirmed. The schoolhouse needs some repair, he admitted. We've been meaning to address it. Some of the shutters are off their hinges and there's a section of the floor that's, well, it's manageable. We'll get to it. I would appreciate that sooner rather than later, Henrietta said pleasantly. If I'm to teach adequately, the building should be adequately maintained. Several of the council members exchanged glances that suggested she had surprised them, and Sheriff Beaumont, who had said almost nothing throughout the meeting, permitted himself a small smile at the corner of his mouth. She had been in Caldwell 4 days when she first saw Tobias Sullivan at anything approaching leisure. She had taken to walking in the early morning before the heat arrived and made walking unpleasant down the main street, then out along the trail that led east of town, where the land opened up and the sky was so large it was almost frightening. She was on this walk, with her notebook because she had always written things down, had always believed that writing was the surest way of understanding experience, when she heard a horse approaching from behind her and stepped to the side of the trail without turning. The horse slowed. She turned then, one hand raised slightly against the morning sun. Tobias Sullivan was on a dark bay horse that moved with the comfortable authority of an animal that trusted its rider and was trusted in return. He looked down at her with the same direct, uncomplicated gaze she remembered from the depot, not startled, not performing, simply registering her presence. "Mrs. Garrison," he said. "Morning." "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan." He glanced at the notebook in her hand. "You're out early." "I like the early morning, before the heat." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she had the sense that this was something they agreed on, not as a polite exchange but as a genuine point of common ground. She expected him to ride on. The trail east led to the ranches, and he clearly had somewhere to be. Instead, he paused for a moment and said, "The schoolhouse shutters. I was going to speak to someone on the council, but I can fix them myself if that's more useful. I'm handy enough with a hinge." She blinked. How did you know the shutters needed fixing? Passed by the schoolhouse yesterday. It's noticeable. He paused again, the same unhurried quality she had observed in every exchange with him, as though he had decided that saying things only when they were worth saying was a rule worth keeping. I have time Friday afternoon if that suits. That would be very helpful, she said, and meant it. The council says they'll attend to it, but I suspect they won't do so quickly. A flicker of something, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it, moved across his face. Councils rarely do. He tipped his hat then and rode on, and she stood watching the bay horse move east along the trail with its easy, ground-covering stride, and she turned the moment over in her mind like a smooth stone. He had offered to repair the shutters not because he had been asked, not because it would benefit him in any evident way, but simply because he had noticed they needed doing and happened to be able to do it. This, she thought, was the kind of man who was not as rare as he ought to be, but was, in fact, quite rare indeed. Friday afternoon arrived with the particular clarity of a summer day in Kansas that has decided to be beautiful without qualification. Henrietta was in the schoolhouse, which she had spent the week assessing and beginning to put in order, when she heard the sound of a wagon outside. She came to the door and found Tobias Sullivan climbing down from a wagon that held timber planks, a hinges box, and various tools arranged with the neat practicality of a man who planned his work before beginning it. He worked without talking much, which she found she did not mind. She stayed in the schoolhouse, unpacking the crates of books that had arrived on the train, and the sounds of his work came through the open windows, the clean knock of a hammer, the occasional creak of wood being set correctly into place. After an hour she brought him water from the pump, and he accepted it with a nod and drank and handed the cup back. "Are there more than the shutters wrong?" she asked. He turned and looked at the building with that straight-on gaze. "There's a floor section on the east side that should be replaced before winter. Some of the window glass is cracked, cold will come through that. The stovepipe fitting is loose, which is a fire concern." "I mentioned the floor to the council," she said. "I know. I'll speak with Potts about the lumber. He's the most likely to actually follow through." He looked at her then, and there was a kind of respectful directness in it that she had not encountered often from men. Most men looked at her as a problem to be solved or a prize to be considered. He looked at her like she was a person with a legitimate interest in the matter being discussed. This town needs the school to function properly. The children need it. "Do you have children?" she asked, and then immediately felt the question was too personal, but he answered it without discomfort. "No, I'm not married." He paused. "I had a brother with 2 boys back in Texas. I think often about what kind of men they'll grow into and what shaped me when I was their age." Something crossed his face that was private, that he did not elaborate on and she did not press. "Education matters." "It does," she said. They looked at each other for a brief moment in the afternoon light, and then she said she should get back to the books, and he said he should get the last shutter done before the light changed. And they went back to their separate work with the comfortable efficiency of people who have understood something about each other without needing to name it. The school opened on the 1st of September, 1879, with 19 children ranging from 6 to 14 years of age, and Pearl Whitmore had been right. They were wild, but not bad. They were children who had grown up in a place where survival had priority over sitting still, and sitting still was exactly what she needed them to learn to do for several hours each day. She managed it through a combination of genuine engagement. She told stories, drew maps on the board, made arithmetic into problems involving cattle and land and money, things they understood, and a firm, unhurried authority that she suspected, surprised them by not breaking. The mother of 3 of the children, a woman named Clara Hennessy, whose husband ran a small farm north of town, came to the schoolhouse at the end of the first week and said, "My James says you're the best teacher he's ever had." Then she added, "He's only ever had Mrs. Farnsworth, so it's not as grand a compliment as it sounds, but I mean it truly." Henrietta liked Clara immediately. Clara was frank and warm and appeared to organize her view of the world along practical lines, which Henrietta appreciated. They fell into a natural friendship over the following weeks, meeting for coffee on Saturday mornings at the boarding house or at Clara's kitchen table. It was at Clara's kitchen table, on a Saturday in late September when the air had turned and carried the first cold edge of coming autumn, that Tobias Sullivan's name came up again. Clara's husband, Frank Hennessy, had come in from the yard and sat down at the table with them, helping himself to the coffee pot with the ease of a man in his own house, and had said, "Sullivan stopped by the east field this morning. He said the fence line between our properties is coming down and offered to help me repost it next week." Clara looked at Henrietta with the expression of a woman who is sharing information she believes will be interesting. "He does that, Tobias. He looks out for the neighboring properties, not in an interfering way, in a good neighbor way. He fixed the schoolhouse shutters," Henrietta offered, and felt the slight careful quality of her own voice. Frank Hennessy looked up from his coffee with an expression that was entirely guileless. "Did he? Well, that's like him. He notices things that need doing and he does them." "He comes to the school sometimes," Henrietta said, which was true. Once or twice a week, Tobias would stop by in the afternoon when the children were gone, to check on the stovepipe fitting he'd been meaning to address or the floor section he'd arranged with pots to have fixed. They would talk for a few minutes, standing in the afternoon light of the improving schoolroom, and she had begun to look forward to those few minutes in the way that she had, as a girl, looked forward to certain passages in certain books, with a certainty that something true was going to be said. Clara was watching her with the expression of a woman who sees precisely what is happening and is enjoying it immensely. Frank Hennessy was looking at his coffee. "He's a good man," Clara said simply. "He seems to be," Henrietta said. In October, Caldwell hosted what Herschel Odom told her was a semi-annual social, a dance held in the livery stable of a Mr. Craddock, who apparently had the largest barn in town and was willing to clear it for such occasions. Pearl Whitmore informed her that attendance was essentially mandatory for anyone who wished to be considered a member of the community, and since Henrietta considered herself very much committed to becoming a member of the community, she put on her better dress green wool, less appropriate for the Kansas heat, but autumn had arrived and made it sensible and allowed Pearl to approve her appearance with a scrutinizing nod before they walked together to the Craddock barn. The barn was transformed adequately, lanterns hung from the beams, hay bales arranged around the edges for seating, a fiddle player and a banjo player occupying one corner, with the focused intensity of men who took music seriously. The population of Caldwell and its surrounding farms and ranches appeared to have largely arrived, and the noise of it was warm and alive in the cool October night. She had been there perhaps half an hour. She had been introduced to an alarming number of people, had danced once with the mayor, who was enthusiastic if not technically accomplished, and had accepted coffee from Clara Hennessy, when she saw Tobias Sullivan at the edge of the barn. He was standing with Frank Hennessy and another man she didn't know, and he was wearing a clean shirt and had apparently made an effort with his hair, and he looked, she thought privately, quite remarkably good. He was laughing at something Frank had said, and it was the first time she had seen him laugh fully. It changed his face completely, opened it up in a way that was warm and unreserved, and she felt something in her chest shift slightly in a direction she wasn't prepared for. He looked up and saw her, and the laugh faded into something quieter, and he said something to Frank and made his way across the barn. "Mrs. Garrison," he said. "Mr. Sullivan. I didn't know you came to these things." "I don't always," he admitted. "Frank convinced me this time." There was a pause in which the fiddle struck up something with a dancing rhythm, and several couples moved to the cleared center of the barn. "Would you dance?" he asked, and the asking had a slight careful quality to it, as if he was not certain of the answer and thought the uncertainty worth acknowledging. "I would," she said. He was a better dancer than she had anticipated, not showy, but confident, with the same physical ease he brought to everything. And she found that dancing with a man who moved with genuine ease was a very different experience from dancing with men who were thinking about dancing. They moved through the pattern of the reel without talking, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand at her waist and his hand holding hers, and aware that she was aware of it. When the music stopped, they stood for a moment in the slight disorganization that follows a dance. "Would you like to sit?" he said. "It's cooler over on the east side." They sat on a hay bale near the east wall and they talked. Not about anything in particular at first. The harvest, the state of the schoolhouse floor now that Potts had sent a man to fix it, the stovepipe situation which had been resolved. But then it shifted, the way conversations sometimes do when two people have decided without saying, so that they trust each other enough to say real things. He told her about coming to Kansas from Texas 3 years before. He said he had left because his father's death had left a tangled estate that his older brother had needed to sort out, and Tobias had found himself restless and unnecessary, and he had heard there was open range in Kansas, and had come north with a small stake and the intention of building something of his own. He said it without self-pity, simply as the account of a decision and its consequences. She told him about Cincinnati, about Daniel, about the decision to come west. She said it plainly, that Daniel had been a good man who had died, that she had mourned him properly, and that after 2 years of living in her mother-in-law's house with the careful, suffocating kindness of a woman who meant well but could not see Henrietta as anything other than a widow, she had needed something of her own. She said it without apology, and he listened to it without offering false comfort or awkward sympathy, which was exactly the right response. "What do you think of it?" he asked. "Kansas." "Now that you're in it," she thought for a moment. "Honest," she said. "It's an honest place, not gentle but honest. I think I needed that." He nodded slowly, looking out across the barn, and she had the sense that this was a conclusion he had come to independently some time before and was simply recognizing it again. "Yes," he said, "that's the right word." They sat for a while longer, not talking, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that exists between people who are at ease in each other's presence. The fiddle started up again on the other side of the barn. Walking back to the boarding house that night with Pearl, who was mercifully not talking because she was saving her observations for the morning, Henrietta looked up at the Kansas sky, which was extraordinary, vast and clear and thick with stars in a way that the sky in Cincinnati never was, and permitted herself to think about Tobias Sullivan without immediately redirecting the thought. She thought, he is a man who does not stare and does not perform and does not fill space with words that don't mean anything. She thought, he listens as if listening is a skill he has practiced and values. She thought, I have been in Caldwell, Kansas for less than 2 months, and I am already thinking about a man in a way I had not expected to think about anyone for a long time, perhaps ever again. She looked at the stars for a while longer, and then she went inside and went to bed, and she slept better than she had in months. November arrived in Caldwell with the cold decisiveness of a season that knew exactly what it intended. The schoolhouse stovepipe was fully repaired, the floor was solid, and the cracked window glass had been replaced with Tobias Sullivan's quiet insistence to the council that it was a fire hazard if the stove put out any heat at all. The schoolroom was warm, and the children arrived in coats and wool hats, red-cheeked and loud, and settled into the rhythm of learning with the gradually increasing ease of people who had decided that this was their routine now. Tobias came by the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-November, not for any repair this time, but because, as he said when she asked what brought him, he had brought some books from a crate he had unpacked. He had purchased a set of encyclopedias the previous spring from a traveling salesman, he explained, and the school might find them of more use than he did. She accepted the encyclopedia's 5 solid volumes, well-made and not cheap, and said, "This is too generous." "I've read them twice," he said. "They're more useful here." She set them on the shelf she had built from salvaged planking along the north wall, and he looked at the shelf with the evaluating eye of a man who notices such things and said, "That shelf isn't level." "I know," she said. "I can fix it." "You fix everything," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite teasing but was adjacent to it, warm and lightly surprised. He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted from the practical to the personal, just briefly, just enough. "Not everything," he said, "only things worth fixing." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the books and said, "The children will love these," and he said, "Good." And they found themselves back on comfortable ground, though the ground had moved slightly, and they both knew it. The week before Thanksgiving, there was a commotion in town that briefly occupied everyone. A cattle buyer named Morse, who had been operating in Caldwell for the trail season, had a dispute with a pair of trail hands over money he owed them for work done. The dispute became loud and then briefly physical in the street in front of the general store, and Sheriff Beaumont sorted it out with the efficient authority of a man who had dealt with considerably worse. Tobias was in town for supplies when it happened, and helped Beaumont get the situation under control before it escalated, simply by being the kind of large, calm, solid presence that reminds people that things are not worth the trouble of escalating. Afterward, she heard about it from Clara Hennessy and then later from Tobias himself, when he came by the school on Friday and she mentioned she had heard there had been a disturbance. "It was settled," he said. "Were you hurt?" He looked faintly surprised at the directness of the question. "No, ma'am." "Were you concerned?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. The men were upset and had reason to be upset. Morse had cheated them. That's a real grievance. He paused. There are men who come through this town who have been treated badly by the people who hired them and have very little recourse. It's not right. She had been teaching arithmetic and she set down her chalk and looked at him fully. "No," she said. "It's not right." They looked at each other, and what passed between them in that moment was the recognition of shared values, not performed, not strategic, just genuine agreement about what mattered. In Henrietta's experience, it was among the rarest things in the world to find. He stayed for dinner that evening. Not planned, Pearl Whitmore had seen him at the gate when he was leaving the schoolhouse and had simply said, "Come to supper," with the tone of a woman who does not frame invitations as questions, and he had accepted with the easy good manners of a man who is comfortable with people who say what they mean. It was the first time she had sat across a table from him for an extended period, and she found that this, too, was easy, not the performing ease of polite company, but the real ease of people who have established that they do not need to perform for each other. Pearl fed them both and kept up a stream of commentary on the town's affairs that required just enough response to keep the conversation alive without demanding that either of them carry it. And under this comfortable cover, Henrietta and Tobias talked about the encyclopedias, about teaching, about ranching and cattle cycles, and what the winter was likely to bring. When he left, Pearl collected the dishes with an air of great satisfaction and said nothing at all, which was more eloquent than anything she could have said. December arrived with snow, not the tentative snow of Ohio, which apologized for itself, but the frank, committed snow of the Kansas plains, which arrived with the full intention of transforming the landscape and followed through entirely. The streets of Caldwell went white, and the prairie went white, and the cottonwoods stood black against it. And the cold was the kind of cold that makes a person understand why every culture that has ever experienced winter developed a mythology of fire and warmth as sacred things. The school continued because Henrietta refused to close it for weather short of a blizzard, and she was gratified to find that the children came anyway, bundled and grumbling but present. Their parents were making a decision to send them, which was its own statement about what the school had become. Tobias came to town less frequently in December because the road from his ranch was challenging in snow, but he came. He always came on Wednesdays, she had noticed, And she had noticed that she noticed this and had decided to simply accept that she noticed it rather than doing anything about it. On the last Wednesday before Christmas, he came with a small package wrapped in brown paper and said it was for the school. She unwrapped it to find a good quality wall clock, solid brass, the kind that would keep accurate time for years. "The school should have a clock," he said. "Yes," she said. "It should. Thank you, Tobias." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she heard it as she said it, and so did he. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had come to know quite well over these months, and said, "Henrietta," simply, trying it in the same way, and it sounded like something settling correctly into place. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said. He did not stay long. He had to get back before the light changed and the road became difficult. But at the door he paused and turned and said, "I wonder if you would like to ride out to the ranch on Saturday, if the weather allows. There's a view of the valley from the East Ridge I think you'd like it." She thought of Pearl's expression and Clara Hennessy's quietly knowing eyes and the entire town of Caldwell, Kansas, which had the attentive awareness of a place where not much escaped notice. "I would like that very much," she said. Saturday was clear and cold, and the snow had settled into a hard crust that sparkled in the low winter sunlight with a beauty that was almost painful. He came for her at the boarding house with 2 horses, his dark bay and a steady roan that he said was a good trail horse, not given to nerves. Pearl watched them leave from the doorstep with an expression of very deliberate neutrality that convinced no one, least of all Henrietta. The ride to his ranch was about 8 miles, most of it across open land that was extraordinary under snow, flat and vast, and so quiet that the sound of the horses' hooves on the frozen ground was the loudest thing in the world. They rode mostly in comfortable quiet, occasionally pointing out things, a hawk circling, a line of deer prints, the way the light caught the creek where it hadn't quite frozen over. The ranch itself was modest and solid, a main house built from timber and stone, a barn, a bunkhouse for the 2 hands he employed. The hands, a young man named Ellis, and an older man named Rodrigo who had come up from New Mexico, nodded respectfully and went about their business with the easy manner of men who were used to their employers' ways. "It's not grand," Tobias said, showing her the main house, which was clean and practical and had the slight bare quality of a house that has been arranged for function rather than habitation. "It's honest," she said, echoing the word she had used about Kansas, and saw him recognize it. He made coffee on the iron stove, good coffee, careful coffee, the coffee of a man who has decided that some things are worth doing correctly, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours. Really talked. About his early years in Texas, about his father, about the particular loneliness of building a life without anyone who knew you from before to witness it. About her parents, still living in Cincinnati, still confused about why she had gone west, still sending carefully worded letters that managed simultaneously to express support and concern. About Daniel and what a good marriage had felt like, and what its loss had felt like, and how a person rebuilt not happiness exactly, but the capacity for it. He said, looking at his coffee cup, "I have thought about this ranch as something I am building for the future. But I have thought about it in a way that has been incomplete, as if I was building a structure without quite knowing what would live in it." She was very still. "That's an honest thing to say." He looked up at her, and there it was, the feeling she had been aware of since the depot, since the morning on the trail, since every Wednesday afternoon and every shared silence, arrived at its full clarity. It was not the dizzy, consuming fever of young love. It was something quieter and more durable, the recognition of a person who fit, who matched in the ways that were not obvious but were essential. "I am not good at saying things in a roundabout way," he said. "I find I am better at saying them directly." "I've noticed that," she said. "I have come to care about you very much," he said. "More than I expected to care about anyone again. I'm not asking anything of you. I only thought it should be said." She looked at him steadily, This man who had not stared at the depot when every other man had, who had fixed the shutters and brought encyclopedias and mended the stovepipe and listened to everything she said as if it mattered, who talked about fairness and children and honest work as if these things were simply the correct ordering of the world. "Tobias," she said, "I have come to care about you too, also more than I expected." The kitchen was warm, the stove radiating heat into the winter day, and outside the snow lay brilliant and silent across the Kansas plain. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that for a while, looking at each other with the full, careful attention of two people who have decided that what they have found is worth being careful with. He rode back to town with her in the late afternoon, the sun going orange and low over the prairie, and at the gate of the boarding house he said, "Would you come again? On Saturday?" "Yes," she said. The winter progressed, and they progressed with it. It was not a rapid or spectacular courtship by the standards of dime novels, but it was real and steady and built on the same foundations as everything else they had established: direct communication, genuine regard, a shared sense of what mattered and what did not. She came to the ranch most Saturdays when weather allowed. He came to the schoolhouse on Wednesdays. They had supper at the boarding house sometimes, and at the Hennessy's, and once at the small hotel restaurant that Pearl acknowledged was a step above ordinary occasion. Clara Hennessy was, she suspected, restraining herself from active celebration with significant effort. Pearl Whitmore was simply satisfied, in the manner of a woman whose assessment of both parties had proved correct. In February, when the winter was deep and the prairie was enduring the hard middle months with the prairie's characteristic resilience, they were riding back from the ranch on a Saturday afternoon when the conversation arrived at the question that had been present between them for some time. "I have been thinking," Tobias said, and she waited for the rest of it with the patience she had learned from watching him be patient. "I have been thinking that what I want is for you to stay, not just on Saturdays, not just in Caldwell. I mean, I want to ask you to marry me, if that is something you would consider." She looked at him on the bay horse in the February cold, this man who had spent 6 months being exactly who he was without adjustment or performance, who had built a ranch with his own hands and fixed shutters that weren't his problem and brought encyclopedias and listened and listened and listened. "I would consider it," she said. "I would more than consider it. Yes, Tobias. Yes." He looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, with the precise observation she brought to everything, the best expression she had ever seen on a human face. Not triumphant, not relieved, not even conventionally overjoyed. Simply deeply, quietly glad. "Good," he said, and then, more softly, "good." They were married in April of 1880, on a clear Saturday when the prairie was greening and the meadowlarks had returned, and the sky was the specific rich blue of Kansas in spring. The ceremony was at the small Methodist church on Elm Street, performed by Pastor Whiting, who kept it dignified and appropriately brief, and witnessed by Pearl Whitmore and Clara and Frank Hennessy, and Herschel Odom and Sheriff Beaumont, and the entire town council, and approximately 40 other people, because Caldwell had decided this was an occasion worth attending. Henrietta wore a dress of ivory lawn that Pearl had helped her find through a seamstress in Wichita, who had done the alterations by mail, and she carried a small bouquet of prairie flowers that Clara had assembled that morning with serious artistic effort. Tobias wore a dark suit that he had apparently purchased specifically for the occasion and which fit him well, and which he would, she suspected, continue to feel slightly uncomfortable in for the entire day, because he was a man more suited to canvas and denim than broadcloth, and she loved that about him. He was waiting at the front of the church when she came in, and he watched her come down the aisle with the same direct, full attention he had given everything else about her since the beginning, and she thought, "Yes, this is right. This is the truest thing." The reception was held in the Craddock barn, as seemed right, with the same fiddle player and banjo player who had played at the October social where they had first danced. They danced that night until both of them were laughing and breathless, surrounded by the people of Caldwell, Kansas, who had decided to celebrate this union with the wholehearted commitment of a community that takes its good news seriously. She moved to the ranch in April, and the school found a replacement teacher, a young man named Mr. Carey from Missouri, who was adequate if not gifted, and whom Henrietta helped settle in with the generous efficiency of a woman who wanted the school to continue to succeed even though it was no longer hers. She extracted 2 promises from the town council before she left, that the floor would continue to be maintained, and that the encyclopedia stayed. The ranch, once she brought her eye and her energy to it, became the house she had known it could be. Not grand, she had no interest in grand, but inhabited, with books on shelves and curtains at windows, and a kitchen garden along the south wall where she grew tomatoes and squash and herbs that she had never expected Kansas to support, but which turned out to be willing. Tobias watched her transform the space with an expression of consistent quiet delight, and helped with everything she asked and left alone everything she didn't, which was the exact right calibration. She learned the cattle operation over the summer with the same methodical seriousness she had brought to teaching, asking questions, taking notes, being honest about what she didn't understand. Tobias taught her without condescension and without making it a performance, simply explaining what needed explaining and trusting her to understand it. By autumn, she had a working knowledge of the operation that Rodrigo, the older hand, acknowledged with the slight surprised respect of a man recalibrating his expectations. Ellis, the younger hand, had clearly decided that Henrietta was magnificent and treated her with the reverent, slightly flustered deference of a young man in the presence of someone he deeply admires. She found this charming and set about quietly educating him in the spare minutes, vocabulary, arithmetic, the general extension of his knowledge that a good teacher cannot resist providing when the opportunity presents itself. The prairie autumn of 1880 was extraordinary. She had come to understand by now what people meant when they talked about the beauty of the Kansas plains. It was not the beauty of pretty things, but the beauty of true things, of scale and light and season, and the particular magnificence of a place that makes no concessions to human preference. She loved it with the same love she had developed for Tobias himself, steadily, with clear eyes, with gratitude for its honesty. There were difficulties, as there always are. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was severe, a series of blizzards that kept them snowbound at the ranch for days at a stretch, which might have been trying and instead turned out to be one of the happiest times of her life. She and Tobias, housebound, talked for hours, the long, winding, revelatory conversations of people who have time and inclination and genuine interest in each other's inner life. He had been reading more since their marriage. She had given him books with the casual determination of a person who believes that reading is a gift that keeps paying forward, and they discussed what he read with the seriousness and occasional disagreement of intellectual equals, which he was, she had come to understand, in the fullest sense. He was not a formally educated man. He had received the basic schooling of a Texas ranch family, supplemented by voracious self-directed reading in the years since. But he thought with clarity and precision, and without the defensive pride that sometimes makes uneducated men resistant to learning. He simply had questions about the world and wanted answers, and she was, among other things, well equipped to help with that. In March of 1881, she told him she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning before the day had begun, because she felt it was the kind of news that deserved the morning, the fresh, clear beginning of a day, not the weighted end of one. She said it simply, watching his face. What happened to his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not the performance of a man responding to expected news in the expected way. It was something that moved through him like a season changing, like a shift in weather, like a man who has been waiting for something without knowing he was waiting and has now received it. He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his and held them and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am," she said. "I feel fine. A little tired in the mornings, but fine." He nodded and held her hands, and she could see him reconfiguring the future in real time, not anxiously, but with the careful, glad attention of a man who wants to get the details right. "I'll speak to Rodrigo about taking on more of the daily writing," he said, "so I can be closer to the house." "Tobias," she said, "I'm pregnant, not unwell." "I know that," he said, and looked at her with the faintest smile. "I'll still speak to Rodrigo." She shook her head at him fondly, and he lifted her hands and pressed them briefly to his lips, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way through her. Pearl Whitmore, when told, produced an expression of profound satisfaction that suggested she had been waiting for this information since the previous April. Clara Hennessy embraced her in the yard of the ranch, and then stood back with shining eyes and said, "Oh, good. Oh, this is very good," with the particular joy of a woman who loves children and has been hoping her friend would have some. The baby came in November of 1881, a boy, delivered in the ranch house by Doc Purvis from town, with Pearl Whitmore in attendance because Pearl had decided to be there, and Doc Purvis had learned over the years that Pearl Whitmore in attendance was more help than hindrance. Tobias was in the kitchen for most of it, which Pearl had firmly arranged, and which he endured with the tight, controlled patience of a man experiencing something that is entirely beyond his ability to manage by competence. When Doc Purvis came to the kitchen door and said, "Come in, Sullivan, you have a son," Tobias stood up from the chair so fast it scraped against the floor and crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. She was tired in the way that goes to the bone, but she was whole and clear-eyed, and she was holding a baby who had arrived in the world with the decisive competence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The baby was red and small and astonishingly present. She could feel the life in him, bright and insistent. Tobias sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them, and she had never seen his face like this, open in a way that had nothing guarded about it, not even the gentle privacy he kept around his deepest feelings. He looked entirely undefended. "Can I hold him?" he said. She transferred the baby to him with the careful instructions of a woman who is trusting someone with the most important thing she has, and he held his son with the serious, gentle competence he brought to everything, cradled against his chest, and looked down at him for a long moment. "What do we call him?" he said. They had talked about names. She had a preference and he had a preference, and they had agreed without great difficulty, the way people who genuinely agree on most things manage to agree without conflict. "James," she said. "James Daniel Sullivan." Daniel for her first husband, which Tobias had suggested himself, because he was the kind of man who understood that a person's history is part of who they are and is not a threat to what exists now. James because it was a solid, honest name that belonged to no one complicated. "James," Tobias said to the baby quietly. "Hello." The baby, with the magnificent indifference of newborns everywhere, was entirely unconcerned. The years that followed were the years of building, not frantically, not desperately, but with the steady accumulation of good decisions and honest work and the compounding interest of a life shared between two people who genuinely suit each other. The ranch grew. Tobias bought the neighboring parcel to the north when it came available in 1883, which doubled their range and added to their herd. He hired 2 more hands, a pair of brothers named Curtis and Walter Pike, who were competent and reliable and worked well with Rodrigo, who had become the de facto foreman with the natural authority of a man who knows more than anyone else about the operation. Ellis, the young hand who had been there at the beginning, had taken Henrietta's informal tutoring seriously enough that he had, by 1882, learned to read fluently, and had begun studying on his own with a focused ambition that clearly had a direction, though he hadn't named it yet. She suspected he would leave eventually, not because the ranch wasn't good to him, but because something was calling him forward, and she thought this was right and hoped he would go. James grew into a child who had his father's direct gaze and his mother's habit of noticing everything, which was a combination that made him simultaneously easy and challenging to raise. He was curious and energetic, and had the native fearlessness of a child who had grown up around horses and open land and competent adults, and he followed his father around the ranch with the devoted intensity of a small shadow. In the spring of 1884, a second baby arrived, this time a girl, born with Tobias present in the house and Pearl Whitmore again in attendance, though Doc Purvis this time had a younger assistant doing most of the actual work. The girl was born in the early morning, just as the light was coming up over the prairie, and she arrived with a set of lungs that made clear immediately that she intended to be heard. They called her a leaner, for Tobias's mother, who had died when he was 14 and whom he had loved and not spoken of often but had clearly never stopped missing. When he said the name, holding his daughter in the same careful, serious way he had held James, there was something in his face that was both old grief and new joy, existing together in the way they sometimes do in a person who has lived enough to know that grief and joy are not opposites. "Eleanor," Henrietta said, and it was right. Caldwell itself continued to change, as towns on the frontier changed in those years, growing, acquiring, becoming more complex. The cattle trail business fluctuated with the railroad's expansion and the shifting economics of the beef trade. New families arrived. New businesses established themselves. The school had expanded to a proper schoolhouse with a second room and 2 teachers by 1883, which satisfied Henrietta even though she was no longer teaching in it, because the thing she had built had survived her. She did not stop teaching entirely. She taught James at home, and when the neighboring children's parents asked, she taught them too, informally, a small gathering of children 2 mornings a week in the ranch house, which expanded naturally over time into something that was very nearly a school without quite being official. Mr. Carey, the replacement teacher, had moved on to Wichita in 1882, and his replacement had written to her for advice 3 times in the first year, which she had provided freely and without vanity. There were harder things too, because life is built of them alongside the good. In the winter of 1883, Rodrigo died quietly, in his sleep, without apparent suffering, which was the death of a man who had worked hard and deserved rest. They buried him on the ranch property, on the east ridge with the view Tobias had first shown her, because it seemed right. The hands attended, and Tobias spoke about Rodrigo with the particular, direct dignity of a man who does not perform grief, but does not conceal it either, and she stood beside him with her hand in his and felt the loss with him. There was also, in 1884, a difficult period with a neighboring rancher named Aldred Cass, who had arrived in the county the previous year, and had begun making expansive claims about the range north of the Sullivans' new parcel claims that were legally questionable and personally aggressive, and which required Tobias to engage a lawyer from Wichita and several uncomfortable months of negotiation. It was resolved, eventually and correctly, in their favor, but it was the kind of experience that drains a person even in resolution, and Henrietta saw it take a toll on Tobias that he tried, as was his nature, not to make visible. She refused to allow the invisibility. She said to him, one evening after the children were in bed, sitting in the kitchen in the lamplight with the legal documents finally filed and the matter closed, "You can be tired. It is allowed." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the expression she had come to know better than her own face in a mirror, the expression that appeared when she said something that reached past the practical and the controlled to the person underneath. "I know," he said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said honestly. "I am." She moved her chair around the table to sit beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat in the warm kitchen with the documents done, and the children sleeping and the prairie quiet outside, and the tiredness could simply be. By 1885, Caldwell was different from the raw cattle town she had arrived in. The Kishom Trail had been significantly curtailed by the advancing railroad and the closure of Kansas to Texas cattle on account of disease concerns. The cattle drives that had been the loud, aromatic, rowdy engine of Caldwell's commerce were fading. The town was having to reinvent itself as something less wild and more permanent, which was a process that suited some people and alarmed others. The Sullivan Ranch was well positioned in this transition. They had built around local beef supply and local markets rather than the trail commerce, and the region's growing settler population needed beef reliably. Tobias expanded the operation again in 1885, this time with a small dairy, heard that Henrietta had proposed after a conversation with a woman from one of the newer farm families who had mentioned the difficulty of sourcing fresh milk. It was not a large undertaking, but it was consistent, and it proved Tobias's willingness to follow her thinking into practical territory, which she found deeply satisfying in ways that went well beyond the dairy operation itself. Ellis, the young hand, left in 1885. He left for Topeka, where he had been accepted to read law in a lawyer's office, something he had arranged himself through correspondence, using the reading ability he had built largely through Henrietta's informal instruction. He came to say goodbye on a Tuesday morning in September, standing in the ranch yard with his hat in his hands, a slight roughness in his manner that was emotion trying to be practical. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, "I want to say thank you for the reading and the writing and all of it. You did the work yourself," she said. "I only provided the material." "Still," he said. She pressed a book into his hands, a good one, something he would find useful and something he would enjoy, because she still believed both of those things mattered, and shook his hand and said, "Write to us. Let us know how you get on." He nodded and turned to Tobias, and they shook hands in the particular way of men who respect each other, and Ellis climbed onto his horse and rode east toward the Topeka road, and they watched him go. Tobias put his arm around her shoulders as they watched. "You did that," he said. "He did that," she insisted. "The reading," he said. "The confidence, you gave him that." She leaned into him slightly. "It's what teachers do. They give people what they already have." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been looking into for 6 years now, and which she had never in 6 years found anything but genuine in. "That's the best way I've ever heard it put," he said. James was 4 years old and Alina was a baby when the range dispute with Cass had happened, and by 1886 James was 5 and Alina was 2, and they were both, Henrietta was increasingly certain, going to be extraordinary. James had begun reading, partly from her instruction, but partly from the same driving self-motivated curiosity that had carried Ellis to Topeka, and she recognized it in him with the particular joy of a teacher who sees the love of learning take root. Alina was at the stage of locomotion and investigation that is maddening and magnificent simultaneously, and had a personality that seemed to combine the best of both of them with several qualities that appeared to be entirely her own. Pearl Whitmore became, over these years, something of an institution at the ranch. She had semi-retired from the boarding house, handing its management to a young couple from Missouri, and she appeared at the Sullivan Ranch on Sundays for dinner with the regularity of a woman who has decided that this family is her family and intends to attend accordingly. She told Tobias things directly, when she felt they needed saying, with the prerogative of an older woman who has earned the right. She told Henrietta things directly when those needed saying too. She was Aunt Pearl to James and Alina, who adored her with the instinctive wisdom of children who recognize people worth adoring. Clara and Frank Hennessy remained the closest of friends. Their farm and the Sullivan Ranch had a relationship that was both commercially practical and personally warm, the two households moving through the years with the comfortable rhythm of people whose lives have become genuinely entwined. Clara had 2 more children after the years of their friendship began, and James and the Hennessy children grew up in and out of each other's company with the easy familiarity of almost cousins. The spring of 1887 was when Tobias built the porch. It was not a grand project. It was a covered porch along the south side of the ranch house, built from good timber with a solid roof and enough space for 2 chairs. He built it himself over the course of 3 weeks in March and April, working evenings and weekend mornings. And when it was done, he called her out to see it with the slight but visible anticipation of a man who has made something for someone he loves and wants to know they love it too. She stood in the afternoon light looking at the porch, at the solid carpentry, the clean line of the roof, the 2 chairs he had placed at the far end where the view of the east pasture was clearest, and felt something she sometimes still marveled at, which was how consistently this life exceeded what she had known to want. "It's perfect," she said. "I thought we needed a place to sit in the evenings," he said. "When the day is done." She looked at him. 6 years of marriage, and he could still, without trying, with nothing but honesty, say a thing that moved her. "We did," she said. "We very much did." They sat on that porch that first evening in April 1887, with the children asleep inside, and the prairie going gold in the last light. And Tobias had coffee and she had tea, and they talked about nothing in particular and about everything in general. The east pasture fence, James's reading, Aliner's increasing mobility and its increasing implications, whether the county fair in September would be as good as it had been the previous year. They talked with the warm, rolling ease of people who have been talking for years and have found that this does not exhaust but replenishes. At one point she said, "I have been thinking about writing." He looked at her. "Writing? A book? Or I don't know yet what form it would take, about education, about teaching children in frontier towns what works and what doesn't. I've been making notes for years." She paused. "It seems like something that could be useful." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through with the seriousness he gave everything she said. "Then you should. It would take time. I know you should still do it." She looked at him in the evening light and felt the full weight of that simple support, not conditional, not complicated by male pride or territorial feeling about her time and energy. Simply, you should. It might not come to anything. "It might not," he agreed, "but I think it will." She began writing in earnest that summer, in the mornings before the household woke, at the kitchen table, with the first light coming through the east window, filling the notebooks she had been keeping since Cincinnati with the accumulated knowledge and observation of 9 years of teaching in Ohio, in the Caldwell schoolhouse, in the informal sessions at the ranch. It was slow work, but it was satisfying in the way of work that is entirely one's own. In the fall of 1887, she received a letter from Ellis, who had been in Topeka for 2 years. He had been admitted to practice law in Kansas, he said, and he was well, and he remembered his time at the Sullivan Ranch with gratitude that he hoped he would someday be able to express more adequately than a letter aloud. She read the letter aloud to Tobias at the supper table, and he listened with the quiet pride of a man whose household had been part of something good. "You should write back and tell him about the book," Tobias said. She did. Ellis wrote back to say he thought it was an excellent idea, and that if she needed someone to review her legal approach to the publication process, he would be glad to assist. She thought this was quite wonderful and said so. The book took 3 years in the writing, between the children and the ranch, and the life of a place that was always asking for something. It was finished in the autumn of 1890, a proper manuscript that she sent, on Tobias's insistence, to an educational publisher in Boston who had been recommended by the principal of the Topeka schools, to whom Ellis had written on her behalf. The publisher held it for 8 months, which was its own kind of endurance test, and then wrote to say they would publish it, with modest revisions, the following year. She received this letter on a November afternoon in 1891, standing in the kitchen, and she read it twice to be certain of what it said, and then she went out to the barn where Tobias was working on a piece of harness and stood in the doorway until he looked up. He looked at her face and said, "Yes." She held up the letter. He set down the harness and crossed the barn in 5 strides and took the letter and read it, and she watched him read it, and when he looked up his face was doing the thing it did when he was deeply, quietly glad. "Henrietta," he said. "It's just a small book," she said, and felt her voice catch slightly. "No," he said, "it isn't." He pulled her into his arms and held her in the barn, smelling of hay and harness oil and the particular warm solidity that was himself, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and felt, for a moment, the full extraordinary weight of how far she had come, from the Cincinnati drawing room to the Caldwell depot to this barn, this ranch, this life, this man who had been the only man on the platform who had not stared. "I owe that depot in Caldwell a debt," she said, into his shoulder. He pulled back enough to look at her. "What? The depot? When I arrived, you were the only man who wasn't staring at me." He looked at her with the slightly puzzled expression of a man genuinely encountering this for the first time. "I was looking at the horizon. I didn't know you were there." She laughed, really laughed, the full warm laugh that Kansas had taught her, that he had helped her find. "I know. That's exactly why it mattered." He looked at her for a moment longer, working this out, and then something settled in his expression that was understanding and something more than that. "I wasn't trying to be anything particular," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the whole point." He shook his head slightly, with the faint, honest smile that was more eloquent than most men's full expressions. "Well," he said, "I'm glad the horizon was interesting that day." "So am I," she said. "Tobias, so am I." The book was published in the spring of 1892 under the title Schooling the Frontier, Methods and Principles for Teaching in Rural Western Communities by Henrietta Sullivan, formerly Garrison. It was not a celebrated literary event. Educational publications rarely are. But it was read, and it was useful, and letters came from teachers in Colorado and Arizona Territory, and New Mexico and Texas, who said that it described exactly the challenges they faced and offered approaches that worked. And this was worth more to her than celebrity. The school board in Caldwell wrote to congratulate her. Mayor Ellison, now somewhat older and substantially more distinguished-looking, sent a note that managed to suggest he had personally foreseen her success, which she found charming in its untruth. Ellis wrote from Topeka to say that he had recommended the book to 3 county school boards and intended to continue doing so. He was engaged to be married, he added at the end of the letter, almost as an afterthought, to a woman named Helen who taught at one of the Topeka schools, and he hoped the Sullivans would come to the wedding if they were ever in Topeka. They went. They packed James, now 10 years old and endlessly interested in the locomotive, and Alina, now 7 and deeply opinionated, into the train for Topeka in September of 1892, and attended Ellis's wedding in a church that was considerably more formal than the Caldwell Methodist on Elm Street, and watched a man they had known as a rough-edged young cowhand stand at an altar in a proper suit and be married to a bright-eyed woman who already clearly saw everything about him clearly and liked all of it. Tobias leaned slightly toward her during the ceremony and said, very quietly, "Something we did." She squeezed his hand without looking away from the ceremony. "Something he did," she said. "Something he did with the chances he was given." "Both," he said. "Both," she agreed. James discovered Topeka with the enthusiastic appetite of a boy who has grown up on a ranch and is encountering a city for the first time, and required more parental attention than a boy of 10 theoretically should. Alina managed herself with the serene self-containment of a child who has already concluded that she is competent and is waiting for the world to catch up to this assessment. They came home from Topeka on a Sunday evening, arriving back at the ranch in the last light, and the horses in the east pasture were moving in the golden hour, and the house was solid and warm and waiting. James ran straight to the barn to check on his horse with the focused relief of a boy who has been away from something important. Alina went to the kitchen and helped herself to leftover cornbread with the purposeful efficiency of a child who knows exactly what she needs. Tobias carried the bags in from the wagon with his usual unhurried ease, and Henrietta stood for a moment at the kitchen door, looking out at the ranch. This was what she had not been able to imagine when she had stood on the Caldwell Depot platform in the summer of 1879, with her trunk and her valise and her dark blue wool dress, watching the men stare. She had not been able to imagine that this was what was ahead of her, not because she had not hoped for something, but because this was too specific, too actual, too completely and precisely itself to be imagined from the outside. A ranch on the Kansas plain with a porch on the south side, and encyclopedias on a shelf and two extraordinary children, and a husband who had looked at the horizon when everyone else was looking at her. Pearl Whitmore appeared for Sunday dinner 2 days later, having somehow known without being told that they were back, and sat at the kitchen table with the comfortable authority of a woman who considers this table partly hers, and said, "Well, how was Topeka?" "Excellent," Henrietta said. "Ellis is very well. His wife is wonderful." "Good," Pearl said. "Ellis was a good boy. He became a good man. That doesn't always happen." "No," Henrietta said, "it doesn't." Pearl looked at her with the expression she had worn since approximately 1879, which was the expression of a woman who is correct and knows it. "You look well," she said. "Both of you look well." "We are well," Henrietta said. "Good," said Pearl, and helped herself to the coffee as if this settled the matter, which it did. The years continued. James grew into a young man who had his mother's love of books and his father's love of land, which turned out to be a combination perfectly suited to the kind of careful, knowledgeable ranching that the changing cattle economy of the 1890s increasingly required. By the time he was 15, he was working the ranch with genuine competence, not as a child helping but as a second pair of hands with real knowledge, and Tobias taught him everything with the patient, thorough instruction of a father who has decided that his son will understand the reasons behind every practice, and not merely the practices themselves. Alina announced at the age of 9 that she intended to be a teacher, and at 10 that she intended to be a doctor, and at 11 that she had not yet fully decided but was keeping her options open, and Henrietta responded to each announcement with the same calm encouragement, because she had been a teacher long enough to know that the important thing was not the specific destination, but the belief that destinations were reachable. Tobias said, when Henrietta reported this, "She'll do both." "She might," Henrietta said. "She will," he said, with the certainty of a man who has assessed his daughter accurately. In 1895, the Caldwell school that Henrietta had begun approached her about returning in an official capacity, not as a classroom teacher, but as a kind of supervisor and advisor, helping to train the younger teachers and develop the curriculum. The town had grown enough that the school now had 3 rooms and 5 teachers, and the school board had read her book and decided that she was the most qualified person in the county for the role. She talked it over with Tobias at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, with the children in bed and the lamp turned to the corner where the darkness was thickest. "You want to do it," he said. "I think I do," she said. "Then you should." She looked at him. He was 45 now, and the years of outdoor work had deepened the weathering of his face into something that was, she thought, very fine, the face of a man who has made something of his life, and it shows not in display but in structure. He was still lean, still carried himself with the same unhurried ease, though his dark hair had gone gray at the temples in a way she found deeply attractive and which he was entirely unaware of. "It would mean 2 days a week in town," she said. "The horse ride or the wagon. I know, it might be more some weeks." "Henrietta," he said gently, "you have been telling me what you want to do. I am agreeing. We don't need to discuss the complications before we've agreed on the direction." She smiled at him across the table. "You're right. It happens occasionally," he said, with a faint smile. She took the position in September of 1895, and it was, from the first, exactly what she had hoped, substantive and engaging and extending what she had already done into a larger shape. She rode into Caldwell 2 or 3 days a week, and the teachers she worked with were young and willing and improved demonstrably, and the school became, over the years that followed, one of the better rural schools in the county, which several school board reports in Topeka noted with approval. The century turned. January of 1900 arrived in Kansas with the honest cold of a new century that was not particularly impressed with its own significance, and the Sullivan Ranch entered it in good order. The herd was healthy, the dairy operation was profitable, the land well managed. James was 18 and had his father's sure hand with horses and cattle, and had begun in the previous year to show interest in a girl from the Hennessy place, not Clara and Frank's daughter, but the daughter of a cousin who had settled nearby, a sensible young woman named Alice with copper-colored hair and good judgment. And Henrietta watched this development with the warm attention of a woman who remembers exactly what it is to begin something real with a person who is right for you. Alina was 16 and had resolved the doctor question in favor of teaching with a side interest in medicine that would, Henrietta suspected, not stay a side interest indefinitely. She was reading widely and voraciously and asking questions that required Henrietta to consult her own books before answering, which she considered an excellent sign. On a January evening of 1900, the family sat on the south porch after supper, James and Alina and Tobias and Henrietta, wrapped in coats because the porch required dedication in January, but present because the porch had become the place they chose for evenings when there was no particular reason to be anywhere else. The prairie was dark, and the stars were out in the enormous Kansas abundance she had never stopped finding astonishing. James was talking about something, a plan for the north pasture, a particular approach to the spring calving, with the focused enthusiasm of a young man who has recently discovered that his ideas have practical weight. Alina was listening with the evaluating attention that was so characteristic, occasionally asking the sharp question that made James reconsider his phrasing. Tobias was listening to both of them, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. Henrietta sat beside him, listening to her children think and talk and disagree and arrive at something better than either had started with. And she thought about the depot in the summer of 1879, and the man who had not stared, and how little she had known, standing there in her dark blue wool dress, about what was about to begin. She reached over and found his hand in the darkness of the porch, and he turned his palm up and held hers, without looking, without making a thing of it. The way you hold the hand of someone whose hand you have held 10,000 times and intend to hold 10,000 more. James, Tobias said when there was a pause, your mother and I want to hear more about the North Pasture plan. Start from the beginning. James, gratified and slightly surprised, began again. Alina settled back in her chair with the expression of a girl preparing to find the flaw in her brother's argument. The prairie breathed its cold, enormous breath around them. Henrietta, Tobias said, quietly just to her while the children talked. She turned. His gray-green eyes in the dark, familiar as her own name. Good life, he said, just that. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had on that evening with the legal documents done and the children sleeping 10 years ago. The best, she said, the very best. The stars above the Kansas plain were countless and cold and brilliant, and the Sullivan Ranch lay solid and well-made beneath them. The house and the barn and the dairy and the east pasture and the porch on the south side, and the family that had been made from a man looking at the horizon and a woman who had noticed him for exactly that reason sat in the darkness together and were glad. It was, in every way that mattered, enough. More than enough. It was a whole life, complete in itself, built carefully from the ground up, honest in its foundations and warm in its habitation, and it was theirs, and it was good.